The roses were crimson, perfect, and meant for someone else. I watched my husband David cross the restaurant floor, his confident stride carrying him toward a table where a young woman sat alone, her auburn hair catching the candlelight like spun copper. The entire dining room seemed to hold its breath as he approached her, the bouquet of 24 roses cradled in his arms like a newborn. My heart hammered against my ribs as conversations died mid-sentence. Silverware paused halfway to lips, and every eye in Romano's, our anniversary restaurant, our sacred place, turned to witness what they assumed was a romantic gesture, but it wasn't romantic. It was devastating. Sarah looked up at him with those emerald eyes that haunted my sleepless nights, her smile radiant as she accepted the flowers. She stood gracefully, her black dress hugging curves I'd lost years ago to stress and sorrow, and kissed his cheek with the familiarity of lovers. The restaurant erupted in soft applause, thinking they were witnessing something beautiful. How wrong they were. I sat frozen at our table, the one we'd reserved for Valentine's Day, watching my marriage publicly dissolve. David hadn't even noticed I was there. 3 months of investigation, of following him, of piecing together the fragments of his double life had led to this moment. The private investigator's photos burned in my purse, images of secret meetings, stolen kisses, weekend getaways I'd been told were business trips. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Other diners began to whisper, pointing between David and me, recognition dawning on their faces. Mrs. Henderson from the book club covered her mouth in horror. Dr. Phillips, who delivered our stillborn daughter 5 years ago, looked away in embarrassment. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. Every step toward their table felt like walking through quicksand, but I maintained my composure, my smile never wavering. Years of charity galas and corporate events had taught me to mask pain behind perfection. "David," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. He spun around, his face draining of color as he saw me approaching. Sarah's smile faltered, her grip tightening on the roses. "Karen, Happy Valentine's Day, darling," I interrupted, my voice carrying just enough volume for our audience to hear. I reached into my purse, past the photographs, past the tissues I'd prepared for this moment, and pulled out the cream envelope I'd been carrying for weeks. "I also have something for you." His relief was palpable as he reached for what he assumed was a love note, perhaps a poem like the ones I used to write him during our courtship 15 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. He expected romance while giving his heart to another woman. The envelope crinkled as he opened it, his fingers steady with confidence. That confidence shattered the moment he unfolded the papers inside. Divorce decree, petition for dissolution of marriage, asset division, custody arrangements for our surviving son, Michael. The roses slipped from Sarah's hands, scattering across the marble floor like drops of blood. David's face cycled through shock, confusion, and finally something that looked almost like relief. "You knew," he whispered. "I've known for months," I replied, my voice never losing its sweetness. "I just wanted to give you one last Valentine's gift, your freedom." The restaurant had become a theater, and we were the tragic players on stage. But this wasn't the end of the performance. This was merely the first act of a much more complex drama, one where nothing was quite as it seemed, and the most devastating betrayals were yet to be revealed. The discovery had come 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday that started like any other lie. I'd been folding David's shirts when the credit card statement fell from his jacket pocket, the account I didn't know existed, hotel charges, jewelry purchases, restaurant bills for 2, when he'd claimed to be eating alone on business trips. My hands shook as I photographed each line item, my mind calculating not just the money spent, but the elaborate deception required to hide it all. 22 years of marriage, and I'd never suspected I was living with a stranger. The first private investigator I called was too expensive. The second was too sleazy, with tobacco-stained teeth and wandering eyes that lingered on my legs. Marcus Chen, the third, was different. Professional, kind, with gentle eyes that had seen too much heartbreak. He'd handled my case with the delicacy of a surgeon, documenting David's betrayal with clinical precision. "Some husbands are careless," Marcus had told me during our final meeting, sliding the manila envelope across his desk. "Your husband is meticulous. He's been planning this double life for years." The photos were devastating. David entering Sarah's apartment building. David's car parked overnight in her driveway. David shopping for lingerie in boutiques I'd never seen, his face animated with joy I hadn't witnessed in years. But the most crushing image was from last Christmas. David at Sarah's family gathering, wearing the sweater I'd given him, laughing with her parents as if he belonged there. That night, I'd sat in my car outside Sarah's apartment, watching the warm light spill from her windows. She lived in the arts district, in a converted warehouse with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows. Creative, young, everything I'd stopped being somewhere along the way. I could have confronted him then, could have screamed and thrown dishes and demanded explanations. Instead, I chose strategy over emotion. I opened my own secret account, contacted lawyers, gathered documentation of every asset we'd accumulated together. If David wanted to play chess with our marriage, I'd show him what checkmate looked like. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal, cooking his favorite meals while imagining him eating with her, doing his laundry while knowing another woman was undressing him, listening to his lies about late meetings and weekend conferences, while my heart crystallized into something harder and colder. Michael, our 17-year-old son, noticed the change first. "Mom, are you okay?" he'd asked one evening, finding me staring at the family photos that lined our hallway. Pictures of happier times when David's smiles were genuine, when his arm around my waist meant something. "Just tired, sweetheart," I'd replied. The same lie I'd been telling myself for months, but I wasn't tired. I was furious. Furious at David for stealing years of my life with his deception. Furious at myself for becoming the kind of woman a man could abandon without a second thought. Furious at the world for letting love die so quietly that no one noticed until it was too late. The planning consumed me. I researched divorce law, calculated alimony, inventoried our possessions with the thoroughness of an auctioneer. Every detail had to be perfect, because I would only get one chance to destroy him the way he'd destroyed me. Valentine's Day had been his idea, ironically. "Let's go to Romano's," he'd suggested, kissing my forehead with lips that had been kissing another woman. Like old times, as if we could resurrect something that was already buried. I'd agreed, of course, already knowing about his reservation with Sarah, already planning my theatrical finale. The divorce papers had been ready for weeks, waiting in my purse like a loaded weapon. I'd practiced my speech in the mirror, perfecting the smile that would hide the ruins of my heart. Now, standing in Romano's with rose petals at my feet and divorce papers in my husband's trembling hands, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, but emptiness. This wasn't the victory I'd imagined. It was just the end of everything I'd once believed in. David looked up from the papers, his eyes searching mine for something. Forgiveness, perhaps, or at least understanding. But I had nothing left to give him except the truth he'd been running from. "We'll discuss the details through lawyers," I said, my voice carrying across the silent restaurant. Then I turned and walked away, leaving behind not just my marriage, but the woman I'd been when I believed in forever. We met in a bookstore on a rainy Thursday in October, 23 years ago. I was 25 then, working as a junior editor at a small publishing house, drowning in manuscripts and coffee, convinced that love was something that happened to other people. My arms were full of research books for a historical romance I was editing when I collided with a tall man carrying an equally precarious stack of legal texts, books scattered across the philosophy section like oversized confetti. "I'm so sorry," he said, immediately dropping to gather my scattered volumes. His voice was warm honey over gravel, and when he looked up, his brown eyes held flecks of gold that caught the bookstore's amber lighting. "Are you hurt?" "Only my pride," I replied, kneeling beside him to collect my books. Our fingers brushed as we reached for the same novel, and I felt something electric pass between us, a recognition that went deeper than attraction. David Whitmore, 27, newly graduated from law school, working at his father's firm and hating every moment of it. He wanted to write. He told me over coffee that stretched into dinner, then into a walk through the city that lasted until dawn. Poetry, specifically, though he was embarrassed to admit it. A lawyer who wrote sonnets in secret, hiding his sensitivity behind three-piece suits and legal briefs. "What's the point of poetry?" I'd asked, genuinely curious. In my world of commercial fiction and market-driven manuscripts, poetry seemed like an indulgence. "To capture moments that would otherwise disappear," he'd answered, stopping under a streetlight to study my face. "Like right now, the way the rain has made your hair curl, the way you're looking at me like you're trying to solve a puzzle. Poetry makes permanent what time would steal." I fell in love with him that night, completely and irrevocably. Our courtship was a series of stolen moments between his demanding job and my editorial deadlines. He'd leave handwritten poems tucked in my mailbox, verses about my laugh, my hands, the way I bit my lip when concentrating. I'd edit his work with the same care I gave my authors, marveling at his ability to find beauty in ordinary things. The proposal came a year later, in the same bookstore where we'd met. He'd arranged with the owner to hide it during a poetry reading, slipping the ring into a first edition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets. When I opened to How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. The diamond caught the light like captured starlight. I want to count the ways for the rest of my life, he'd whispered, kneeling between the stacks of books that had brought us together. Our wedding was small but perfect, held in his family's garden with roses climbing the arbor, where we exchanged vows he'd written himself. Karen, he'd said, his voice breaking with emotion, you make me want to be the man I see reflected in your eyes. The early years were golden. David joined a smaller firm that valued his intellect over his pedigree, while I worked my way up to senior editor. We bought the house on Maple Street, with its wraparound porch and mature oak tree, planning to fill it with children and laughter. Sunday mornings were for pancakes and crossword puzzles in bed. Evenings were for wine and conversation, and the kind of intimacy that goes beyond physical to something transcendent. Michael arrived after 3 years of trying, a perfect baby with his father's eyes and my stubborn chin. David would spend hours reading to him, not children's books but poetry, believing that rhythm and rhyme would shape our son's dreams. Those were the happiest years of my life, watching my husband transform into a father, seeing him discover new depths of love I hadn't known he possessed. Then came the losses that began our unraveling. The first miscarriage happened when Michael was 2, then another. Each loss carved something away from us, left us a little more broken, a little more distant. The poems stopped coming. David threw himself into work while I retreated into books, both of us grieving in isolation instead of together. Sarah Elizabeth would have been our daughter, born sleeping at 7 months, perfect in every way except the one that mattered. I held her for hours, memorizing her tiny features, while David stood at the window with his back to us, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. We can try again, he'd said finally, but his voice was hollow. I can't, I'd whispered, and something fundamental broke between us. Recovery was supposed to bring us closer. Instead, it revealed how far apart we'd drifted. David became successful, driven, cold. I became careful, guarded, afraid to want anything too much. We moved through our routines like actors in a play, hitting our marks but forgetting our motivation. When did he stop seeing me? When did I stop trying to be seen? The transformation was so gradual, I didn't notice until it was complete. The man who once wrote poetry about my eyes now barely looked at me. The woman who once believed in forever stopped believing in anything at all. Now, driving home from Romano's with the taste of public humiliation still bitter in my mouth, I wondered if the David I'd fallen in love with had ever really existed, or if I'd simply been in love with potential, with the man he might have become if life hadn't taught him to hide his heart so well. Sarah Chen was 28 years old, a graphic designer with paint-stained fingers and dreams bigger than her studio apartment. I knew everything about her, thanks to Marcus's thorough investigation and my own careful observation. She grew up in Portland, the daughter of immigrants who sacrificed everything so she could attend art school, graduated summa cum laude, moved to the city with nothing but talent and determination, built a small but respected design firm from scratch. She was everything I'd once been, hungry, ambitious, unafraid of taking risks, everything I'd stopped being somewhere along the way. The day after Valentine's Day, I found myself parked outside her building again, not sure what I hoped to accomplish. Part of me wanted to see her broken, destroyed by the revelation that the man she loved was married. Part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, was simply curious about the woman who'd stolen my husband's heart. She emerged at 9:17 a.m., exactly when Marcus's surveillance notes said she would. No makeup, hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing jeans and an oversized sweater that somehow made her look effortlessly beautiful. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world, never questioned whether she was worthy of love. I followed her to a small cafe in the arts district, watching as she ordered her usual oat milk latte, extra shot, no sugar. She chose a corner table and opened her laptop, designer fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced ease. Even in heartbreak, she was productive. Even devastated, she was moving forward. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I bought a coffee and approached her table, my heart hammering against my ribs. She looked up as I approached, her green eyes widening with recognition, and something that looked almost like relief. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly. "Karen, may I sit?" I asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. She nodded, closing her laptop and wrapping her hands around her coffee cup like it was an anchor. Up close, she was even more beautiful, the kind of natural loveliness that doesn't need enhancement, that glows from within. I understood why David had fallen for her. What I didn't understand was why she'd fallen for him. "I owe you an apology," she said before I could speak. "Not for loving him, but for the way you found out. You deserved better than that public humiliation." Her honesty disarmed me. I'd prepared for tears, for defiance, for attempts at justification. I hadn't prepared for accountability. How long? I asked. 18 months, she replied without hesitation. Since the Morrison merger. He came to my firm to rebrand his father's company. 18 months. Not the 3 I'd suspected. She'd been sleeping with my husband for a year and a half, through Christmas mornings and anniversary dinners, through Michael's junior year milestones, and my mother's funeral. Did you know he was married when it started? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it held answers. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Yes, she whispered. I knew. The admission hit me like a physical blow. It would have been easier to hate her if she'd been an innocent victim, seduced by a lying husband. But she'd chosen this, chosen him, chosen to help him betray me. Why? The question came out broken, raw. Because he said you didn't love him anymore, she said, tears finally spilling over. Because he said your marriage had been dead for years. Because he told me you were just staying together for Michael, that you both wanted out but didn't know how to end it. And you believed him? I wanted to believe him, she corrected. There's a difference. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. In that moment, she looked younger than her 28 years, vulnerable in a way that reminded me of myself at that age. He showed me poems he'd written for you, she continued. From when you were young, he talked about how creative and passionate you used to be, how life had worn that away. He said he saw glimpses of who you used to be in me. The irony was devastating. David had fallen in love with Sarah because she reminded him of me, the me he'd helped destroy through years of neglect and emotional distance. He never stopped loving you, she said quietly. That was the problem. I was his way of loving who you used to be. Then why didn't he leave me? I asked. Because he was terrified. Terrified of starting over. Terrified of admitting failure. Terrified of hurting Michael. He thought he could have both, the security of his old life and the passion of something new. He thought he could compartmentalize. But you couldn't. No, she admitted. I couldn't. I wanted all of him, not just the pieces he could spare. That's why I gave him an ultimatum 2 weeks ago. Choose me or choose his marriage. But stop trying to have both. The timeline clicked into place. 2 weeks ago, David had been different. Distracted, agitated, drinking more wine with dinner. I'd assumed it was work stress. Instead, he'd been facing an impossible choice between the woman he'd married and the woman he'd fallen in love with. What did he choose? I asked, though I already knew the answer. You, Sarah said simply. He chose you. The roses yesterday. They were goodbye. He was ending it. The world tilted beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about Valentine's Day, about the divorce papers, about my dramatic gesture of revenge, had been wrong. David hadn't been leaving me for Sarah. He'd been leaving Sarah for me. The revelation reframed everything, turned my righteous anger into something more complicated and infinitely more painful. I drove home from the cafe in a daze, Sarah's words echoing in my head. He chose you. The roses had been goodbye, not hello. The public meeting had been David's way of ending their affair, not beginning a new life. My theatrical delivery of divorce papers hadn't interrupted his betrayal. It had interrupted his attempt at reconciliation. The house felt different when I walked through the front door, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of our secrets. I found David in his study, still wearing yesterday's clothes, surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled tissues. He looked up when I entered, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Sarah told me, I said without preamble, about the ultimatum. About your choice. He closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging under invisible weight. Then you know how badly I've destroyed everything. I sat down across from him, studying the man I'd shared a bed with for 22 years. When had the lines around his eyes become so deep? When had his hair gone from dark brown to distinguished silver? When had we stopped really looking at each other? Tell me about the poems, I said. His head snapped up, surprise flickering across his features. What? Sarah said you showed her poems you'd written for me, from when we were young. I leaned back in the leather chair, crossing my arms. I haven't seen a poem from you in 15 years, David. I thought you'd stopped writing them. I never stopped writing them, he said quietly. I stopped sharing them. Why? He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because you stopped reading them. After Sarah Elizabeth, after we lost her, you stopped reading everything I wrote. You'd say thank you, but your eyes would stay empty. Eventually, I realized the poems were hurting you instead of helping, so I kept them to myself. The memory hit me like cold water. Those months after our daughter's death, when David would leave verses on my pillow, trying to write our grief into something beautiful. I couldn't bear to read them then, couldn't stand his attempts to find meaning in meaninglessness, so I'd smile and thank him, and file them away unread, not realizing I was filing away pieces of his heart. I was protecting you, he continued. But somewhere along the way, protection became distance. Distance became silence. Silence became this. He gestured between us, encompassing 20 years of slow deterioration. So you found someone who would read your poetry. I found someone who would see me, he corrected. The same way you used to, before life beat the wonder out of both of us. I wanted to be angry, wanted to hold on to the righteous fury that had sustained me through months of planning and plotting. But sitting in the ruins of our marriage, surrounded by the detritus of our shared disappointments, I felt only a bone-deep weariness. When did we stop fighting for each other? I asked. Gradually, he said, then all at once, like falling asleep or going broke. So slowly you don't notice until it's too late to change course. I thought about the woman I'd been when we met, the one who read poetry and believed in love and saw possibility in everything. That woman had been buried under years of losses and compromises, of small betrayals and smaller concessions. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being someone worth fighting for and started being someone who needed protecting from disappointment. Do you love her? The question came out steadier than I felt. I loved who she reminded me of, he said. I loved the way she made me remember who I used to be, but it wasn't fair to her, and it wasn't fair to you. What about now? Do you love me now? He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time in years. I love the ghost of who we were. I don't know if I love who we've become. The honesty was brutal and necessary. We sat in silence, contemplating the wreckage of our once great love, both of us mourning not just what we'd lost, but what we'd never learned how to keep. Michael knows, David said eventually, about the affair, about the divorce papers. He called this morning, furious with both of us for making a spectacle of our family, our son, 17 years old and forced to witness his parents' public destruction. The guilt hit me fresh and sharp. Where is he? At his friend Jake's house. He said he can't look at either of us right now. Another casualty in our war of attrition. We'd been so focused on our own pain that we'd forgotten we weren't the only ones who would pay the price for our failures. What do we do now? I asked. David looked at the divorce papers scattered across his desk, then at me. I don't know, he admitted. I genuinely don't know if there's anything left to save or if we're just holding on to the corpse of something that died years ago. Maybe that's the real question, I said, standing to leave. Not whether we can fix this marriage, but whether we want to become the kind of people who could. As I walked toward the door, David called my name. I turned back to find him holding a leather journal I'd never seen before. The poems, he said, all of them, from the day we met until yesterday. If you want to read them, if you want to know what I was too afraid to say out loud, they're all in here. I took the journal, feeling the weight of 2 decades of unexpressed love and unspoken grief. On the cover, in David's careful handwriting, was a single word, Karen. That night, I sat in our empty bedroom and read 20 years of poetry written for a woman I barely recognized. Me, as seen through the eyes of a man who'd never stopped loving her, even as life taught them both to stop believing in forever. The poems revealed a man I'd forgotten existed, and a love I'd convinced myself was dead. Each page was a window into David's inner world, the place where he'd processed our joys and sorrows, our fights and reconciliations, our slow drift from passionate lovers to polite strangers. The early poems blazed with desire and wonder, capturing moments I'd forgotten, the way I'd dance in the kitchen while cooking, how I'd fall asleep reading manuscripts in bed, the face I made when concentrating on difficult edits. But as the years progressed, the poems changed. The celebration became elegy. The wonder transformed into worry. There were verses about my growing silence after each miscarriage, about the way I'd started sleeping on the far side of the bed, about how my laughter became rare and then disappeared altogether. She moves through our house like a ghost now, present but untouchable, speaking in practical sentences that hold no room for dreams. I want to ask what happened to the woman who used to dance, but I'm afraid I already know. She learned that hope is dangerous, and I forgot how to teach her it's worth the risk. The poem was dated 3 months after Sarah Elizabeth's funeral, 3 months when I'd been drowning in grief, and David had been drowning too, but separately. We'd lost our daughter, and then lost each other in the aftermath, each retreating to private hells we couldn't share. As I read deeper, I began to see the pattern. David's poems tracked my withdrawal with devastating accuracy, chronicling each small rejection, each closed door, each conversation that never happened. But they also revealed his own failures, his increasing absences, his emotional unavailability, the way he'd chosen work over intimacy and safety over vulnerability. Today I found her crying in the baby's room, still decorated with yellow walls and careful neutrality. I wanted to hold her, but I've forgotten how to offer comfort without feeling like I'm intruding on her private grief. We're strangers living in the same house, roommates with a shared mortgage, and separate heartbreaks. The truth was more complex than either affair or abandonment. We'd both retreated, both chosen self-protection over connection, both let fear make our decisions, until we'd built a marriage of safety instead of passion. David's affair with Sarah wasn't an escape from our life together. It was an attempt to recapture what we'd let slip away, but knowing the truth didn't make it hurt less. If anything, understanding David's motivations made the betrayal more painful, because it meant our marriage hadn't died from neglect. It had died from cowardice, our mutual inability to fight for what we'd once had. I was halfway through the journal when my phone rang. Marcus Chen's name appeared on the screen, and I answered without thinking. "Karen, I've been trying to reach you since yesterday. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I lied, wiping tears I hadn't realized were falling. "Why are you calling?" "Because I made a mistake," he said, his voice tight with professional concern. "A big one. Can you meet me at my office tomorrow morning? There's something about your case I need to explain." "The case is over, Marcus. I served the papers. It's finished." "No," he said quietly. "It's not. Karen, there's something about Sarah Chen that you need to know. Something I should have told you weeks ago." The urgency in his voice made my stomach clench. "What are you talking about? I can't discuss it over the phone. Please just meet me tomorrow at 10. And Karen, don't make any final decisions about the divorce until we talk." He hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone with a growing sense of dread. What could Marcus possibly know that would change anything? The affair had happened. David had chosen to end it. I'd chosen to end our marriage. What other revelations could possibly matter now? I turned back to the journal, hoping David's words might offer some clue, some hint about what Marcus had discovered. The later poems were the hardest to read, filled with self-recrimination and desperate longing for the woman I'd been. "I met someone today who reminds me of you, not the you that sleeps beside me now, careful and quiet and closed, but the you I fell in love with 20 years ago. She laughs like you used to laugh, dreams like you used to dream, believes in impossible things the way you used to believe in us. I know it's wrong to want her, wrong to use her brightness to illuminate the shadows we've let grow between us. But for a few stolen hours, I remember who I was when I was worthy of your love." That poem was dated exactly 18 months ago, the day he'd met Sarah. The final entry was from last week, just days before Valentine's Day. "Tomorrow I end this beautiful mistake that taught me what we lost but cannot give me what we had. I will break a good woman's heart to save what's left of mine, and pray that somewhere in the ruins of who we've become, there's still a foundation strong enough to rebuild upon. Karen, my first love, my only love. If you're reading this, then you know I never stopped writing you into existence on every page of my life." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. David hadn't just chosen me over Sarah. He'd chosen the possibility of us, the ghost of what we'd been, the hope that love could survive the damage we'd done to each other. But was hope enough? Could two people who'd forgotten how to be vulnerable learn to love each other again? And what did Marcus know that could change any of it? Outside, dawn was breaking over the house we'd filled with dreams and emptied of joy. In a few hours, I'd learn whatever truth Marcus had been hiding. But first, I had to decide. Did I want to save my marriage, or did I just want to understand what had killed it? The answer, I realized, might be the same thing. Marcus Chen's office smelled like strong coffee and old secrets, the kind of place where truth came with a price tag, and nothing was ever quite what it seemed. I arrived exactly at 10, having spent the sleepless night reading and rereading David's poems, trying to reconcile the man who'd written them with the man who'd betrayed me. Marcus looked haggard when his secretary ushered me in, as if he'd been wrestling with his conscience and losing. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his cluttered desk. "Coffee? Just tell me what's so important it couldn't wait for the divorce to be final." He opened a thick file folder, the same one he'd presented to me 3 months ago with such clinical precision, but now his hands shook slightly as he pulled out a photograph I'd never seen before. Sarah Chen, but not as I knew her. This woman was younger, maybe 16, standing next to an older man in what looked like a hospital corridor. "Do you recognize the man?" Marcus asked. I studied the image, noting the family resemblance immediately. Same bone structure, same eyes, same stubborn set to the jaw that I'd seen in my bathroom mirror every morning for 43 years. "That's my brother," I whispered. "That's Jonathan." Marcus nodded grimly. "Sarah Chen's real name is Sarah Chen Martinez. Jonathan Martinez was her stepfather. He married her mother when Sarah was 12. The world tilted. Jonathan, my younger brother who'd died in a car accident 8 years ago. Jonathan, who'd struggled with addiction and failed marriages, who'd moved to Portland to get clean and start over. Jonathan, who'd mentioned a stepdaughter but never by name, never with details that might have made me remember. "She knows who I am," I said, the words coming out flat and strange. "She's known from the beginning. Karen, Sarah didn't meet your husband by accident. She sought him out. She moved here, started her design business, positioned herself to cross his path. The Morrison merger wasn't coincidence. She bid low to ensure she'd get the contract." My hands went numb. Everything I thought I understood about David's affair, about Sarah's motivations, about the cosmic cruelty of betrayal, was wrong. This wasn't a story about a wandering husband and an opportunistic mistress. This was something far more calculated and infinitely more personal. Why? The question came out as a whisper. Why would she target David? Marcus pulled out another document, a copy of Jonathan's will. "Your brother left Sarah everything when he died. His life insurance, his savings, even his car. But there was something else. A letter he wrote to her before the accident, explaining why he'd never introduced her to his family." He handed me a photocopy, Jonathan's familiar handwriting blurring through my tears as I read, "Sarah, my brilliant girl, if something happens to me, you need to know why I kept you separate from my sister and her family. It's not because I was ashamed of you. You're the best thing I ever helped create. It's because I was ashamed of me. Karen has this perfect life, this perfect marriage, this perfect house with the white picket fence. She always did everything right while I did everything wrong. I couldn't bear to let her see another one of my failures, another broken family, another stepdaughter who deserved better than what I could give. But you deserve to know her. She would have loved you like her own daughter, the daughter she lost. Maybe someday, when I get my life together, I'll find the courage to build that bridge. Don't let my cowardice rob you of family, Sarah. You're smarter and stronger than I ever was. If you want to know your Aunt Karen, make it happen. She needs people like you in her life, people who believe in tomorrow." The letter fell from my hands. Jonathan had kept Sarah from me not out of shame about her, but out of shame about himself. He died believing I thought I was better than him, when all I'd wanted was to help him heal. "She came here for revenge," I said, understanding flooding through me like ice water. "She blamed me for Jonathan keeping her away." "Initially, yes," Marcus confirmed. "She told me she wanted to understand why Jonathan thought you were so perfect, why he put you on such a pedestal that he couldn't bear to disappoint you. She researched your life, your marriage, your family. She was looking for cracks in the foundation, and she found them. She found David, a successful, respected man who was quietly dying inside his perfect life. She saw an opportunity to prove that your marriage was as flawed as any other, that you weren't the untouchable ideal Jonathan had made you out to be." I thought about Sarah in the cafe yesterday, the genuine tears, the remorse that had seemed so real, but something changed. Marcus nodded. "About 6 months into the affair, Sarah contacted me. She wanted to call it off, to disappear and leave your family alone. She said she'd gotten what she came for, proof that everyone's life has cracks, but she didn't want to destroy your marriage anymore." What stopped her? David wouldn't let her go. By then he was in love with her, or at least in love with what she represented. When she tried to end it, he convinced her that your marriage was already over, that she'd be saving him rather than destroying him. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Sarah had come to break us apart, but David had been so broken already that he'd mistaken her manipulation for salvation. "There's more," Marcus said quietly. "The reason Sarah gave David the ultimatum 2 weeks ago, she didn't want him to choose between you and her. She wanted him to end the affair so she could disappear from your lives forever." Then why the public meeting? Why Romano's? Because David insisted on a dramatic gesture. He said he owed her a proper goodbye, something public and meaningful. He didn't understand that Sarah was trying to protect you from further humiliation. I laughed, but it came out bitter and broken. So she was trying to save my marriage while I was planning to destroy it. "Karen," Marcus leaned forward, his voice gentle. "I should have told you about the connection to Jonathan immediately. It was unethical for me to continue the case once I discovered it. I'm sorry." "Why didn't you?" "Because by then, I'd watched you transform. When you first came to me, you were a defeated woman who'd given up on herself. The investigation, the planning, the decision to fight back, it gave you purpose again. I didn't want to take that away from you, even if the foundation was built on lies." I sat in silence, processing the weight of revelation. Everything I'd believed about my marriage, my husband, my life, had been filtered through Sarah's carefully constructed deception. But the deception had revealed deeper truths about the distance between David and me, about the way we'd let fear replace intimacy, about the slow death of dreams deferred. "What do I do now?" I asked. "That depends," Marcus said. "Do you want justice, or do you want healing?" I thought about David at home, surrounded by the wreckage of his choices. I thought about Sarah, living with the guilt of a plan that had spiraled beyond her control. I thought about Michael, caught in the crossfire of adult failures and childish mistakes. Most of all, I thought about Jonathan, my baby brother who'd died believing I thought I was too good for his messy, complicated love. I want the truth, I said finally. All of it, no matter how much it hurts. Marcus nodded and reached for his phone. Then it's time for a family reunion. Sarah arrived at Marcus's office 20 minutes later, her face pale but composed, like someone walking to their own execution with dignity and tact. She stopped in the doorway when she saw me, her green eyes, Jonathan's eyes I realized now, filling with tears she was too proud to shed. "You know," she said. "It wasn't a question. I know you're Jonathan's stepdaughter. I know you came here to destroy my marriage. What I don't know is why you changed your mind." She took the chair beside mine instead of across from me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something light and floral that reminded me painfully of spring, of hope. "Because Jonathan lied to me," she said quietly, "about you, about what kind of person you were. He didn't lie. He just didn't know the truth." Sarah turned to study my face, searching for something. "He told me you were perfect, that you had this ideal life with your ideal husband in your ideal house, and that's why he could never measure up. He made you sound like someone who'd never made a mistake, never struggled, never failed at anything that mattered." "Jonathan was an addict," I said gently. "Addicts see the world in extremes. I was either his salvation or his damnation, never just his sister. I know that now, but when he died, I was so angry. Angry at him for keeping me from you. Angry at you for being the standard he could never reach. Angry at the world for taking away the only father I'd ever known." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. "Jonathan used to do the same thing when he was trying not to cry. So you decided to prove I wasn't perfect. I decided to prove you were human. I thought if I could show Jonathan, even though he was gone, that your life was as messy as everyone else's, it would somehow make his failures hurt less." Marcus cleared his throat. "Sarah, tell her about the journal." Sarah's face crumpled. "What journal?" "Jonathan kept a journal about you," Marcus said gently. "About his stepdaughter who was too good for him, too smart, too talented. About how proud he was of your art, your business, your strength. Karen, he wrote about you too. About how much he missed you, how much he wanted to bring Sarah into the family but was too afraid of disappointing you again." I felt something break open in my chest. "He was proud of you." "He never told me that," Sarah whispered. "He never told me anything about what he felt. He just tried so hard to be someone he wasn't, someone worthy of the family he'd married into." "He was always worthy," I said, the words coming from a place deeper than thought. "I never asked him to be perfect. I just wanted him to be alive." We sat in silence, two women grieving the same man from different angles, understanding finally that we'd both lost him long before the accident that took his life. "When did you realize you were wrong about me?" I asked. "The first time I saw you with Michael," Sarah said. "It was at his soccer game, about a year ago. You were in the stands, cheering for him even though his team was losing badly. Your hair was a mess. You had mustard on your shirt, and you were crying because you were so proud of him just for trying. You weren't perfect at all. You were just a mother who loved her son." The memory came flooding back. Michael's last game of junior year, when his team lost 0-6, but he played his heart out anyway. I'd been so proud of his determination, his refusal to give up even when victory was impossible. "That's when I knew I'd made a terrible mistake," Sarah continued. "Jonathan hadn't kept me from you because you were perfect. He'd kept me from you because you were real, and he was terrified that if you got close enough to see his failures, you'd stop loving him." "I could never have stopped loving him," I said. "He was my baby brother. I know that now, but by then I was already in too deep with David. I tried to end it, but he wouldn't let me go. He said I was the only thing keeping him sane, the only person who saw him as more than just a husband and father and provider. He wasn't wrong about that," I admitted. "I'd stopped seeing him as anything but functional, safe, reliable. I'd forgotten he was human." Sarah pulled a manila envelope from her purse. "There's something else you need to see, something David doesn't know about." She handed me a stack of photographs, David and her together, but not the intimate shots Marcus had shown me. These were different, sadder. In every image, David looked lost, desperate, like a man drowning who'd mistaken a life raft for salvation. "I hired my own investigator," Sarah said. "I wanted to understand what I was doing to your family, what kind of damage I was causing. These pictures, they show the truth Marcus's photos didn't capture." I studied the images with new eyes. David wasn't a man in love. He was a man in crisis, using Sarah as a mirror to see himself the way he used to be. In every shot, he looked hollow, guilty, desperately trying to recapture something that was already lost. He never loved me, Sarah said quietly. He loved the idea of me, the way I made him remember who he was before life taught him to stop dreaming. But Karen, he never stopped writing poetry about you. Even when we were together, even in our most intimate moments, he would get this faraway look in his eyes, and I knew he was thinking about you. Then why didn't you tell him who you were? Why didn't you end it? Because I was selfish, she admitted. For 18 months, I got to pretend I had a family. David would tell me stories about your early years together, about Michael growing up, about the life you'd built. Through him, I got to know you, to love you the way Jonathan did. It was twisted and wrong, but it was the closest I'd ever come to having a sister. The confession hit me like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't just seduced my husband. She'd seduced my life, my history, my family. She'd used David as a window into the relationship she'd never had with me. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for all of it. I know I can never make it right, but I want you to know that meeting you, even like this, has been worth everything that comes after. I looked at this young woman, my brother's daughter in everything but blood, the artist he'd been too broken to introduce me to, the family I'd been denied by his fear and shame. She had Jonathan's creativity, his sensitivity, his deep capacity for love. She also had his ability to make terrible decisions for noble reasons. What happens now? I asked. Now I disappear, Sarah said, standing to leave. I've already closed my business here, terminated my lease. I'm moving back to Portland tomorrow. You'll never have to see me again. Wait, I said, the word coming out before I'd fully formed the thought. What if I don't want you to disappear? She froze, her hand on the doorknob. What? Jonathan kept us apart because he was afraid I'd judge him for his failures. Don't make the same mistake he did. Don't let fear rob us of the chance to be family. Sarah turned back to me, hope and terror warring in her expression. After everything I've done? Because of everything you've done, I said. You made terrible choices for understandable reasons. You tried to make it right when you realized you were wrong. You put my marriage before your own happiness. That sounds exactly like something Jonathan would do. For the first time since entering the office, Sarah smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made her look heartbreakingly young. He would have loved seeing us together, she said. Then let's give him that gift, I replied. Let's be the family he was too afraid to create. The real betrayal wasn't David's affair or Sarah's manipulation. It was the way we'd all betrayed ourselves by choosing fear over love, safety over truth, protection over connection. I drove home from Marcus's office with Sarah following in her car, both of us nervous about the confrontation ahead. David's car was in the driveway, but Michael's wasn't. Our son was still at Jake's house, still too angry to face the wreckage of his parents' marriage. I found David in the kitchen, making coffee with the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions to avoid thinking about unfamiliar problems. He looked up when I entered, then froze when he saw Sarah behind me. What's going on? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. Sit down, I said. Both of you. We're going to have the conversation we should have had months ago. David remained standing, his body tense with fight-or-flight energy. Sarah took a seat at the breakfast table where we'd shared thousands of family meals, where Michael had done homework, and I'd paid bills, and David had read morning newspapers back when we still talked to each other over coffee. Sarah, I said, tell him who you really are. She took a shaky breath and began her story. Jonathan, the connection, the plan for revenge that had become something else entirely. David listened in stunned silence, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of broken understanding. You used me, he said when she finished. Yes, Sarah admitted, at first. But David, you used me too. You used me to avoid dealing with the problems in your marriage. You used me to remember who you used to be instead of figuring out who you could become. That's different. No, I interrupted. It's not. We all used each other, David. You used Sarah to escape from me. I used the investigation to avoid examining my own failures. Sarah used both of us to process grief she didn't know how to handle alone. David slumped into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 50 years. So this whole thing was orchestrated. The affair, the ultimatum, even the way it ended. All of it was planned. The beginning was planned, Sarah said. Everything else was improvisation. David, when I tried to end it 6 months ago, what did you tell me? He closed his eyes, remembering. I said I couldn't live without you. And when I tried again, 3 months ago, I said I'd leave Karen if that's what it took to keep you. And when I finally gave you the ultimatum, I said, David opened his eyes, understanding dawning. I said I had to choose my family, even if it destroyed me. You never chose me over Karen, Sarah said gently. You chose escape over reality, fantasy over the hard work of rebuilding what you'd let fall apart. When I forced you to make a real choice, you chose your wife every time. The kitchen fell silent, except for the coffee maker's quiet gurgling. Outside, spring was coming early. I could see green buds on the maple tree David had planted when Michael was born, back when we still believed in forever. I don't understand, David said finally. If you know all this, if you understand what really happened, then why are we sitting here? Why aren't you packing my bags? Because I'm tired, I said. Tired of being angry, tired of being perfect, tired of being afraid to want things that might disappoint me. Tired of living in a marriage built on safety instead of love. I pulled his poetry journal from my purse and set it on the table between us. 20 years of poems, David. 20 years of loving me in secret instead of fighting for us out loud. You wrote beautiful words about our problems instead of talking to me about solutions. You wouldn't have listened, he said quietly. After we lost the baby, after the miscarriages, you shut down. Every time I tried to reach you, you pulled further away. Because I was terrified, I admitted. Terrified of hoping for things that might be taken away. Terrified of being vulnerable with someone who had the power to destroy me. So I chose numbness over intimacy, control over connection. Sarah was crying quietly, tears streaming down her face as she watched us excavate 20 years of buried truth. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry for all of it. You're trying to heal your marriage and I'm the reason it's broken. No, I said firmly. Our marriage was broken long before you came along. You were just the catalyst that forced us to see what we'd been too afraid to acknowledge. David reached across the table and took my hand. The first time he'd touched me voluntarily in months. His skin was warm, familiar, marked with the small scars of a life lived alongside mine. What do you want, Karen? He asked. What do you actually want from me, from us? I want to know if there's still a David Whitmore who writes poetry because he can't contain his feelings. I want to know if there's still a Karen who believes in impossible things. I want to know if two people who've forgotten how to love each other can remember, or if we're just holding on to ghosts. And if we can't, if we're too broken to fix, then we end this with honesty instead of cruelty. We divorce as friends who loved each other badly instead of enemies who destroyed each other completely. Sarah stood up abruptly. I should go. This is your family's conversation to have. No, I said, surprising myself. Don't go. Jonathan kept us apart for 23 years because he was afraid of being judged for his failures. I won't make that mistake again. Your family, Sarah. Complicated, problematic family, but family nonetheless. She looked between David and me, uncertainty written across her features. I don't understand what you're saying. I'm saying that maybe the real betrayal wasn't any of the things we did to each other. Maybe the real betrayal was the way we all settled for less than what we deserved. You settled for being someone's escape instead of someone's choice. David settled for fantasy instead of fighting for reality. I settled for safety instead of risking everything for love. David squeezed my hand. What are you proposing? I'm proposing we stop settling, I said. All of us. David, I want you to choose, really choose, whether you want to rebuild a marriage with me or end it with dignity. Sarah, I want you to choose whether you want to be part of this family or disappear to protect yourself from more complications. And I'm choosing to stop being afraid of wanting things that might disappoint me. What if we make the wrong choice? David asked. Then we'll fail honestly, instead of succeeding at something that was never real to begin with. For the first time in years, I saw something I'd forgotten in my husband's eyes. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man, but the careful hope of someone willing to do the work of rebuilding from rubble. I choose you, he said simply. I choose us. Not because it's safe or convenient or expected, but because I want to remember what it feels like to love someone who loves me back. I looked at Sarah, this complicated young woman who'd entered our lives as an enemy and revealed herself as family we'd been denied. I choose both of you, I said. The marriage we could have and the family we should have been all along. Sarah wiped her eyes and smiled through her tears. Then I guess I'm not moving to Portland after all. 6 months later, our family looked nothing like it had before, and everything like it should have been all along. David and I didn't magically fall back in love. Love, we discovered, wasn't something you fell into, but something you built, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. We started over with the foundation we'd laid 23 years ago and began constructing something new on top of it, something stronger because we'd learned what happened when you took love for granted. We went to counseling, awkward and resistant at first, then grateful for the neutral ground where we could excavate 20 years of buried resentments and unfulfilled needs. Dr. Martinez helped us understand that our marriage hadn't failed. It had simply stopped growing, stopped changing, stopped adapting to the people we'd become. You fell in love with each other's potential, she told us during one particularly difficult session. Then you got disappointed when reality didn't match the fantasy. The question is, can you fall in love with who you actually are instead of who you thought you'd be? The answer came slowly, in small moments of rediscovery. David started writing poetry again, but this time he shared it with me as he wrote it, making me part of the creative process instead of just its recipient. I started reading again, not just manuscripts for work, but novels and poetry collections and essays that fed something in me I'd forgotten was hungry. We had fights, real fights, the kind we'd avoided for years in our pursuit of peace at any price. We fought about money and parenting and whose turn it was to clean the bathroom. We fought about the affair, about trust, about whether forgiveness was possible, or just another word for denial. But we fought as people who were committed to staying and working through the mess, instead of people looking for excuses to leave. Sarah became part of our strange new constellation, gradually, carefully, like someone learning to trust that the ground wouldn't disappear beneath her feet. She moved into an apartment closer to our house, started attending family dinners on Sundays, helped Michael with his college applications, and David with learning to use social media for his law practice. Michael was the hardest sell. At 17, he was old enough to understand that his parents were human beings capable of terrible choices, but young enough to feel betrayed by the revelation. He spent weeks alternating between fury and heartbreak, between wanting to punish us and wanting to protect us from further damage. "I thought you guys were different," he told me one evening as we sat on the front porch, watching Sarah teach David how to use his camera phone. "I thought you had the kind of marriage that lasted forever." "We do," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "It's just not the marriage we thought we had." "What's the difference?" "The first one was built on the idea that love was enough. This one is built on the understanding that love is just the beginning." Sarah fit into our family like a piece of a puzzle we hadn't known was missing. She brought Jonathan's humor, his creativity, his ability to find beauty in broken things. She also brought her own gifts, artistic vision, technological savvy, and a perspective that helped us see ourselves more clearly. "You know what's funny?" she said one Sunday as we cooked dinner together, her hands covered in flour from the bread she was making. "Jonathan was so afraid you'd judge him for his failures, but watching you guys rebuild your marriage has taught me that failure isn't the opposite of love. Giving up is." The bread was perfect, golden and warm, the kind of comfort food that turns a house into a home. David found his way back to poetry slowly, tentatively, like someone relearning to trust their own voice. The new poems were different from the old ones, less idealistic, more complex, shot through with the knowledge that love was both more fragile and more resilient than he'd understood. "Today I watched you teach Sarah how to make your mother's cornbread, your hands guiding hers through the rhythm of folding batter, and I saw something I'd forgotten, how generous you are with love when you trust it won't be wasted. We are learning each other again, not as we were or as we hope to be, but as we are, imperfect people choosing each other daily, building something beautiful from the wreckage of our mistakes." Michael graduated from high school with honors and chose a college 3 hours away, far enough for independence, close enough for Sunday dinners. The night before he left, he came to me with something I hadn't seen in months, a genuine smile. "I'm proud of you guys," he said, "for fighting for each other instead of just fighting." "Are you okay with Sarah being part of our family?" I asked. "She's cool," he said, "and she makes Dad laugh at things that aren't his own jokes, which is honestly a miracle." The divorce papers sat unsigned in David's desk drawer, not because we were afraid to make a decision, but because we'd already made it. We were choosing each other, choosing the messy complexity of love over the clean simplicity of separation. Sarah chose too. She chose to stay, to build a relationship with the aunt she'd never known, to help heal the family that addiction and fear had fractured. She also chose to start dating someone new, a fellow artist named Marcus who saw her clearly and loved what he saw, who had no interest in using her to escape from his own life. "Are you sure about him?" David asked one evening, his voice carrying the protective tone of someone who'd learned to value what Sarah brought to our family. "I'm sure I want to find out," she replied. "That's what you and Karen taught me, that love worth having is worth the risk of losing." On Valentine's Day, exactly 1 year after the roses and the divorce papers and the public destruction of everything I'd thought I knew about my life, David surprised me with a poem written on handmade paper and framed in reclaimed wood Sarah had helped him sand and finish. 1 year ago, I handed roses to another woman and lost the life I'd been afraid to live. Today I hand you words instead. Imperfect, honest, hopeful words that say what I was too broken to say when we were whole. I choose you, Karen. I choose us. Not because we're perfect, but because we're real. Not because love is easy, but because it's worth the work of building something beautiful from the fragments of who we used to be. That evening, Sarah joined us for dinner at Romano's, the same restaurant where our old life had ended, where our new life had begun. The staff remembered us, of course, remembered the drama and the roses and the divorce papers, but this time, they saw something different. A family that had chosen healing over hatred, growth over grievance, hope over fear. To Jonathan, Sarah said, raising her wine glass as we sat at a table for 4 instead of 2, who brought us together in the most complicated way possible. To second chances, David added. To choosing love over safety, I said. To family, we all said together, and meant it in ways we were still learning to understand. Outside, snow was falling like forgiveness, covering the city in pristine white that made everything look possible again. Inside, we were warm and grateful, and together, 4 people who'd learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to write a better future. The roses were gone, the divorce papers were forgotten, and the love we'd thought was dead had been reborn into something stronger, more honest, more real. It wasn't the fairy tale we'd started with, but it was true, and truth, we'd discovered, was better than fantasy any day. Some stories end with happily ever after. Ours ended with happily, imperfectly, honestly, ever after, which, it turned out, was exactly what we'd been looking for all along.